Viewers, we have been following the action in Syria and Turkey and the Middle East for the few weeks with Abhijit Iyer-Mitra, our guest for today. And we've been seeing some very fast moving development. They say a week is a long time in politics. It's coming out to be true with yesterday, that is Tuesday, October the 22nd, being perhaps one of the worst days in office for President Donald Trump. Why, you ask? First of all, the ambassador of Ukraine essentially spilled the beans about how Rudy Giuliani was practically running Ukraine policy, and that he happens to be the personal lawyer of Donald Trump. So despite the Congress having approved the package, Trump was holding it back from Ukraine because he wanted them to investigate the son of one of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side, Joseph Biden. Okay, so that was one side. Now, a lot of things have happened since then. Let's get an update from Abhijit on his take on who's the winner, who's the loser. Abhijit, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you for having me on, Shri, as usual.
So, Abhijit, what is your take on what has been happening now? The whole world knew that Russia is going to be the winner and Kurds are going to be loser the moment United States decided to pull its troops out of the Kurds area. Now there is a 35-kilometer buffer zone that Turkey wants to create. Lots of reasons being put out by Turkey as to why they need to do all these things. What is your take on this whole stuff?
So there's several strands to this. First thing, of course, is we did not know for sure that Russia was going to win. A lot of people, including me, were skeptical given the state of the Russian army. We thought it was going to be another Afghanistan or Vietnam-like situation. And certainly initially it looked like that. However, we now know for a fact that Russia learns its lessons very, very well. And unfortunately, the Kurds never do. Now, if you look at the spread of the Kurds across the Middle East, there's a large portion of them in Turkey. There's a large portion of them in northern Syria. There's a large portion of them in northern Iraq. And there's a large portion of them in northwestern Iran. Those are the main Kurdish areas. Now, the Kurds have never learned. They keep trying to microbalance against these four powers with external powers. And they never learn from their history that they're not going to succeed. Because when that external power gets what it wants, it leaves the Kurds up to dry, high and dry to just basically rot.
Leaves them to the wolves. Yeah.
This has been, but here's the issue. It's fine blaming everybody else for the Kurds, but what does it say about the Kurds that they're not willing to learn from their own history? I mean, if this has happened to you 10, 15 times now, if you're still not willing to learn from it, shame on you. If somebody makes a fool of you once, shame on them. If somebody makes a fool of you twice, then shame on you. That's how the saying goes. Now, I do have a lot of sympathy for the Kurds, but unfortunately, they're not doing themselves any favor. The writing was very clear on the wall that basically President Assad had won the Syrian civil war. And let's be clear about it, he's on the verge of total victory at the moment, right? I mean, at a terrible cost, of course, but yes, total victory. And, there was no option for the Kurds except to make peace with Assad and negotiate terms. Now, for whatever reason, the Kurds did not do that. And, in the end, Trump has to live up to his election promise, which is not to get bogged down in foreign wars and get their troops home. He doesn't want to be a war president. His entire promise is based on not being a war president. So it's based on not being a war president. So, he had to do what he had to do. How did the Kurds not see this coming is what amazes me. But then let's also be clear that I suspect that what has happened there was in collusion with America between Trump, Putin, and Hafiz al-Assad. Because if the Turks think they're going to have it easy in Syria, they're sadly mistaken. Especially now that the Kurds and the Russians have also done a deal. I mean, today there were pictures of Russian troops in Kobani. So we know there's something happening out there. How it's going to play out is very difficult to say, because the Russians, it seems, have now backstabbed Erdogan and the Turks. Kind of. They're trying to make it seem not like a backstab, but in effect, they have backstabbed, which is the whole story of this entire war, of how many times, all the positions have shifted so rapidly and so often within the space of years, pretty much. But then what's happened is, remember the position Turkey is in. When the initial, this thing happened, what was it? The initial purges of Turkish army officers, there was a loss of capacity. Then finally, there was that attempted coup that resulted in a much bigger purge of Turkish army officers and of the whole of Turkish society, students, professors, and all of that. The Turks are operating at very, very low capacity. Human capacity is not something you can rebuild. This is something we're talking about in terms of the terrorists being infiltrated into Kashmir as well. You don't have turnkey militaries and turnkey terrorists. They need a long periods of heavy capital investment and training. So the Turkish military is completely eviscerated at the moment. How they perform is anybody's guess. I mean, we've seen how the Saudis and the UAE performed in Yemen. The Houthis have been running rings around them, left, right, and center. So, there's no prediction on this. So who are they relying on? They're relying on ISIS and Al-Qaeda allies to be the front line and basically go around a scorched earth policy of terror in northern Syria. Again, this is problematic because remember, these are the same Al-Qaeda, ISIS folks that got completely decimated by the Russians and kicked out, both by the Russians and by the Kurds. So I don't see this happening. I would say that Kurdish ground forces combined with Russian air power and, Turkey will never take on Russia. So just having Russian assets in the region prevents Turkey from attacking. And if Kurdish forces can do something, they'll achieve it. The real secret will be, what can Russia manage to achieve between the Kurds and President Assad?
So, Kurt, as much as I agree with your assessment, they are in a difficult spot, isn't it? I mean, their tribes are spanning 4 countries. How do you think they are coordinating information between all these 4 countries?
But they're not. The Kurds are heavily fragmented. The Iraqi Kurds don't get along with the Syrian Kurds, who don't get along with the Turkish Kurds. There's all kinds of divisions and separations and all of that out there. So, for example, that German footballer of Turkey, Mesut Ozil, is that him? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I forget. I'm not very good at sports. But he is Kurdish, but he identifies as a Turk. So, identity is a very complex issue. Like, I know lots of Uyghurs and Tibetans who identify as Chinese, despite what the news media will tell you. I've actually seen a lot of Tibetans and a lot of Uyghurs who say, they're Chinese. There's not even that thought in their mind that they're anything different. We're Tibetan and we're Chinese. There's no distinction in their mind. So this has happened in Turkey as well. And remember, 4 countries with completely different economic trajectories, completely different social trajectories. The change is bound to happen. Like the change, the psychological change between West and East Germany, post-partition. You can still see that psychological change. Germany still hasn't overcome it completely. In case of North and South Korea, it's even worse. So even with the same people, it can divide you completely. And in this case, they all have competing interests. They don't want to step on each other's feet. I can tell you for a fact, the Iraqi Kurds definitely don't want to do anything to irritate Turkey. So they're not going to do much to help their own brothers and sisters in northern Syria.
So this is one of the problems about understanding the geopolitics in that region. You never know who's with whom, who's against whom, and who's going to be with whom, and who's going to be against whom. But from a big picture point of view, it seems like Russia has filled in the boots vacated by US. Is that correct?
No, because Russia wasn't filling in anyone's boots. There were no boots out there. The problem was it was a proxy war between President Assad and terrorists. And did Assad go overboard and commit human rights violations? Hell yes. But look, they're not a first world country that can afford to, bomb just with great precision and all of that. This is typical World War II style offensives and all of that happening with terrible collateral damage. The thing was the terrorists were a lot worse, even though the Western media always tried to downplay the fact that the terrorists were a lot worse. And into that came Russia. Remember, nobody was willing to put boots on the ground. Not the French, not the Americans, not the Turks even. Nobody. They all wanted to see this play out. They wanted to see more Syrians die. And finally, Russia actually believed that that Europe was going to be thankful to Russia for going in there and stabilizing the situation, and how badly they misread the situation there.
So what lies in the near future for the Kurds now? What do you think is going to change for them?
Unfortunately, I don't think anything is going to change for them. They're going to remain divided in four. They're going to be hardworking, intelligent, industrious people. They're going to keep getting backstabbed, and their culture is going to keep getting suppressed. I think the Iraqi Kurds will manage better than the others somewhat, but I'm not terribly optimistic, unfortunately. It's a pity because they're wonderful human beings, but it is what it is.
Okay. So it looks like things are going to quieten down in Syria under Bashar Assad, however distasteful it might be. So do you think that Syria, the civil war that was in progress, will that subside now? Will the emigration out of Turkey into the West of, not just Syrian migrants, but also Pakistanis, Afghanis, Bangladeshis, perhaps even Indians, anybody tries to go in there as if they are, stuck from the region. Is that going to stop, you think?
Yes, and maybe no, because remember, I don't think this entire movement, a lot of it is from Syria. But when you look at the Bangladeshis, especially the Pakistanis coming out, lots of Pakistani immigrants and refugees coming out, how is it that there's only a war going on in Syria, but they're able to cross through Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and then Turkey, which are all relatively stable, I use the term advisedly, and we're blaming all of this on Syria. So I don't think Syria by itself is the problem out here. Syria is one part of the problem. So is it going to squelch the refugee movement? Not really. But that said, I would like to dispel this notion somehow that Syria under Assad was in any way a bad place. It was one of those places where the security forces never really interfered in your lives. It was definitely one of the more liberal, secular countries in that region. Women could walk around in skirts. They could have professions. And by the way, mind you, in Iran also, Iran is very developed in terms of women's rights, right? Except that they're forced to wear the hijab and things like that. The chador out there, a headscarf, not even a chador. In Syria, it's not like that. So we need to be very, very careful in saying that, Assad was distasteful. Was he a dictator? Yes. But, it wasn't that heavy-handed dictatorship that you saw under his father. It was a much, much more light-handed dictatorship. There were signs of economic development. There were signs of opening up the market and so on and so forth. It didn't work out. And that was entirely because of climate change reasons. Because, in 2007, you had this complete drying up of northern Syria. Because, Syria has always been a power balance between Aleppo in the north and Damascus in the south. And they've constantly never really got along with each other in that sense, because they've always been two different centers of power. And what happens is when you have the entire northern population that's suffering from drought coming down south, massive internal migration, it becomes very, very problematic. It exacerbates resource competition, and that's what happened in this case. Third issue is what happens now from here on after President Assad wins the whole, he's won pretty much, but anyway, when it settles down. Now, remember, you have so many migrants out. Almost 25 to 30% of the country is migrated out of the country or is internally displaced. The demographics of that are horrendous because most of the people that have migrated out have been men. It hasn't been couples and families. So it's not just the fact that within the space of a few years, you've lost so much of your population. It's also that you've disproportionately lost a lot more men than you have women. So you're looking at a loss of population and a demographic imbalance. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because a feminization of society generally makes it much calmer and peaceful. Because, aggression, theoretically speaking, I don't know. I'm just quoting Marxist, Leninist thought process, feminist thought process on
And
this.
we thought you were a right-wing person, but please go ahead.
And you thought I was a right-wing person. My mom hates this because till I was around 25, 27, I was a full-on card-holding communist that used to go singing, quoting from Mao's Red Book. And, I still have Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was the founder of the KGB, on my desk, a bust of him on my desk. But let's see. I'm cautiously optimistic for Syria, but I'm afraid, the wounds are so deep. When you go through such a severe civil war, it's going to take at least 30, 40 years for you to recover, if that.
And, you couldn't have said it. I couldn't have said it better than that. I mean, you are absolutely spot on. These things cause untold damage to the psyche of a nation. And let's hope that, this is all, remember, this all started with the Arab Spring in Tunisia. I mean, this is probably the tail that is now kind of wagging it now. And Syria was one of the last ones that happened to catch that bug. And hopefully it goes down. You have to let people's thoughts free. I mean, even in India, if you ask me, India is independent, but is India free? I have my doubts about that. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on these topics, Abhijit. And as always, a pleasure having you on our channel.
Thank you, Shri. As always, a pleasure being on your channel.